Entity Manager in Jakarta Persistence. Now we are focusing on Entity Manager. The Jakarta.persistence.EntityManager is the primary JPA interface used by applications. An Entity Manager instance is associated with the persistence context. A persistent context is a set of entity instances in which, for any persistent entity, identify there is a unique entity interface, entity instance. Within the persistence context, the entity instances and their lifecycle are managed. The Entity Manager interface defines the methods that are used to interact with the persistence context. The Entity Manager API is used to create and remove persistent entity instances, to find persistent entities by primary key, and to query over persistent entities. As an example, we can consider interface Entity Manager. Interface used to interact with the persistence context. An Entity Manager instance is associated with a persistent context. A persistent context is a set of entity instances in which, for any persistent entity identified, there is a unique entity instance. Within the persistence context, the entity instances and their lifecycle are managed. The Entity Manager API is used to create and remove persistent entity instances, to find entities by their primary key, and to query over entities. The set of entities that can be managed by a given Entity Manager instance is defined by a persistent unit. A persistence unit defines the set of all classes that are related to or grouped by the application, and which must be located in their mapping to a single database. This is in module Jakarta.persistence and package Jakarta.persistence. As an example, we can consider this code segment. This is an example of use of Entity Manager API. Here, annotation type persistence context expresses a dependency on a container managed Entity Manager and its associated persistence context. Here you can see Entity Manager interface used to interact with the persistence context. Here you can see the find method, find by the primary key, search for an entity of the specified class, and primary key. If the entity instance is contained in a persistent context, it is returned from there. And this is entity class, the parameter, and this is primary key. Here you can see a persist method, make an instance managed and persistent. Here you can see the parameter entity instance here. Now we are considering Entity Manager interface in Entity Manager in Entity Operations. Interface Entity Manager in package Jakarta.persistent in module Jakarta.persistence. Interface used to interact with persistence context. find method, provided it is invoked without lock or invoked with lock mode type none, and get referenced method are not required to be invoked within a transaction. If an entity manager with transaction scope persistent context is in use, the resulting entities will be detached. If the entity manager with extended persistent context is used, they will be managed. The query, typed query, stored procedure query, criteria builder, meta model, and entity transaction objects obtained from an entity manager are valid while that entity manager is open. If the argument to the query create query method is not a valid Jakarta persistent query string or valid create criteria query object, the illegal argument exception may be thrown, or the query execution will find and the persistent exception will be thrown. If the result class specification of a Jakarta persistent query language query is incompatible with the result of the query, the illegal argument exception may be thrown when the create query method is invoked, or query execution will fail and persistent exception will be thrown when the query is executed. If the native query is not a valid query for the database in used, or if the result set specification is incompatible with the result of the query execution will fail and the persistent exception will be thrown when the query is executed. The persistent exception should wrap the underlying database exception when possible. Runtime exception thrown by the method of the entity manager interface, other than the locked timeout exception, will cause the current transaction to be marked for rollback if the persistent context is joined to that transaction. Method clause is open, join transaction, and get transactions used to manage application, manage entity managers and their lifecycle. Entity manager interface and other interfaces defined by this with the specification contain method that take properties and or hint as argument. In the specification distinguishes between properties and hints as follows. A property defined by the specification must be observed by the provider unless otherwise explicitly stated. Hint specify a preference on the part of the application, while a hint defined by this within the specification should be observed by the provider if possible. A hint may or may not always be observed. A property application must not depend on the observance of a hint. Now we are considering obtaining an entity manager in the Jakarta EE environment. In entity managers and persistence, obtaining an entity manager. For example, here, a container managed entity manager is obtained by application through the dependency injection or through the direct lookup of the entity manager in the JNDI namespace. The container manages the persistent context lifecycle and the creation of the closing of the entity manager instance transparently to the application. Persistent context annotation is used to enter entity manager injection. The type element specify the whether a transaction is scoped or extended persistent context is to be used. The synchronization element specify whether persistent context is always automatically joined to the current transaction. The default or is not joined to the current transaction unless the join transaction method is invoked by the application. The unit name element may optionally be specified to designate the persistent unit whose entity manager factory is used by the container. The semantic of the persistent context synchronization type of there are types. For example, here the entity manager example, JNDI lookup of an entity manager is illustrated here. Now we are considering And JT entity managers in controlling transactions, an entity manager whose transactions are controlled through the JTA is a JTA entity manager. In general, JTA entity manager participates in the current JTA transaction, which began and committed external to the entity manager and propagated to the underlying resource manager. Now we are considering a resource local entity managers. An entity manager whose transactions are controlled by the application through the entity transaction API is a resource local entity manager. A resource local entity manager transaction is mapped to the resource transaction over the resource by the persistent provider. Resource local entity transaction, local entity managers may use server or local resources to connect to the database and are unaware of the persistence of the JTA transaction that may or may not be active. As an example, we can consider entity exist exception. If the entity already exists, the entity exist exception may be thrown when the persistent operation is invoked, or the entity exit exception or another persistence exception may be thrown at flush or commit time in method void persist object entity in interface entity manager. As an error example, we can consider this no persistence provider for entity manager named error when trying to create entity manager factory in an environment with Eclipse dynamic web project and MariaDB using Hibernate ORM. No persistent provider for entity manager named persist unit. Jakarta.persistence.create entity manager factory, etc.